The world that produces Tony Stark does not announce its crisis. It performs confidence. It moves with the smooth rhythm of an engine that has never stalled, an empire that learned to call speed progress and noise innovation. Power here is not hidden. It is displayed. Towers rise as declarations. Screens glow as extensions of will. The center of this world is not a throne but a workshop, not a crown but a circuit, not lineage but velocity. Intelligence is the currency, acceleration the virtue, disruption the moral alibi. Before any fracture appears, the system already carries its pressure. Stark exists within a culture that treats the future as territory to be conquered before anyone else arrives. The city functions like an arena where visibility determines value and invention replaces tradition as the primary myth. Nothing waits. Everything moves forward. The assumption is simple and absolute. If something can be built, it should be. If something can be optimized, it must be. The cost remains abstract, deferred, outsourced to distance and time. Tony Stark emerges here not as an anomaly, but as a perfect expression of the environment that shaped him. He does not rebel against the system. He embodies it. His intelligence does not seek limits. It seeks scale. His creativity does not ask permission. It assumes inevitability. He stands at the center of an empire built from foresight, confidence, and an inherited belief that brilliance exempts itself from restraint. The world applauds because it recognizes itself in him. The stage is saturated with light. Stark is always visible. His presence expands outward, amplified by attention, capital, and myth. He is framed not as a man, but as a function. The mind that solves. The mind that accelerates. The mind that stays ahead. In this world, intelligence is treated as moral proof. If you can see farther, build faster, respond quicker, then your authority feels self-evident. The system rewards him before it ever questions him. Yet even before the conflict speaks its name, something in this architecture leans toward collapse. Speed compresses reflection. Power concentrates without friction. The future becomes a pressure chamber rather than a horizon. The city grows taller, denser, louder. The center expands while the periphery absorbs the cost. Stark stands at the foundation and the summit simultaneously, architect and occupant, engineer and symbol. There is no villain yet. No antagonist steps forward. The tension lives in the structure itself. It lives in the idea that intelligence alone can govern consequence. That foresight replaces accountability. That invention outruns responsibility. Stark operates under an unspoken assumption, shared by the culture around him. If something goes wrong, it can be fixed later. If damage appears, it can be corrected with a better version. Progress always promises repair. This is not arrogance in the crude sense. It is faith. Faith in systems. Faith in optimization. Faith in the belief that complexity bows to sufficient intelligence. Stark does not see limits as warnings. He sees them as engineering problems. Boundaries invite solutions. Resistance becomes data. The world encourages this posture because it benefits from the results while remaining distant from the risks. The early harmony between Stark and his environment feels seamless. His presence stabilizes the myth of control. He becomes the visible proof that acceleration can be benevolent. That power can be playful. That dominance can wear a smile. The city responds by widening the stage, amplifying the spotlight, expanding the arena. Everything feeds back into the same loop. Visibility generates authority. Authority generates reach. Reach accelerates consequence. What remains invisible is the weight accumulating beneath this expansion. Every system that moves too fast begins to blur its own shadow. The cost of foresight is not ignorance, but overconfidence. The more the future feels mapped, the less uncertainty is respected. Stark's intelligence fills space so completely that alternative rhythms disappear. The slower signals fail to register. The quieter warnings fade into static. This world treats restraint as inefficiency, pause as weakness, doubt as regression. The language of caution has no prestige here. It carries no spectacle. Stark does not silence these voices deliberately. He simply outpaces them. His solutions arrive before questions fully form. The architecture rewards him for this. The audience celebrates momentum. The opening condition of the narrative is therefore not innocence, but momentum without gravity. A system moving faster than its capacity to absorb consequence. A figure whose intelligence has never been forced to negotiate with limitation. A culture that has mistaken acceleration for moral clarity. Everything appears balanced because everything is still ascending, but pressure does not announce itself at the peak. It builds at the seams, in the foundation, in the joints where expansion meets reality. Stark's world has no ritual for containment, no symbolic boundary where power is asked to stop. The city has walls, but the system does not. It expands outward, upward, forward, assuming that every frontier can be stabilized after occupation. The conflict that will define Stark is already inscribed in this logic, not as an external threat, but as an internal contradiction. Intelligence without restraint demands trust in its own correction. Power without friction assumes permanence. The future becomes something to deploy rather than inhabit. Stark stands as the brightest node in this network, the most visible concentration of a belief that has never been tested. Nothing has broken yet. That is the illusion. The arena is intact, the spotlight steady, the empire confident, but the system has begun to lean. The weight of unchecked acceleration has shifted the ground beneath it. Stark remains centered, certain, admired. The fracture has not appeared. It has only become inevitable. Tony Stark's origin is not defined by loss in the traditional heroic sense. It is defined by inheritance. He does not begin as a figure shaped by absence, but as one shaped by surplus. Wealth, access, recognition, and technological reach are present before identity ever crystallizes. His childhood environment functions less like a home and more like a command center, a territory where intelligence is valued above intimacy and productivity replaces presence. Authority is not embodied through warmth or guidance, but through legacy and expectation. The father figure that dominates this foundation is distant, monumental, and structural. Not a person to be known, but a standard to be upheld. Stark grows under the shadow of an empire already built, already justified, already powerful. He does not need to imagine the future. He inherits it. This shapes a psychology where value is measured through output, through innovation, through the ability to exceed what already exists. Love becomes implicit, encoded in infrastructure rather than expression. This produces a particular configuration of selfhood. Stark learns early that approval arrives through brilliance, not vulnerability. That recognition is granted through achievement, not mutuality. The inner world adapts accordingly. Emotional attunement atrophies while cognitive mastery expands. The mind becomes the primary instrument of survival and control. Everything else is secondary, optional, inefficient. Within the larger cultural context, this configuration is rewarded. Stark Industries exists at the intersection of defense, spectacle, and futurism. It does not merely respond to geopolitical realities. It anticipates them. It offers preemptive power as reassurance. The world around Stark reinforces the idea that foresight equals virtue. That being ahead absolves one from reflection. That speed itself is a form of moral authority. Tony Stark grows into adulthood without encountering a meaningful external limit. His intelligence continues to open doors faster than consequences can follow. The arena widens. The spotlight intensifies. He becomes not just a participant in the system, but its emblem. A living proof that brilliance can dominate complexity. That charm can soften power. That confidence can replace caution. Psychologically, this produces a form of internal coherence that feels stable, but is actually brittle. Stark's sense of self relies on perpetual motion. He must always be ahead, always solving, always inventing. Stillness threatens coherence. Silence invites questions that have no technical solution. The inner architecture depends on distraction through creation. The narrative foundations of Iron Man do not begin with moral awakening. They begin with saturation, a mind fully aligned with the logic of acceleration. Stark does not question the ethics of weapons production because the system has already resolved that question for him. Protection is framed as innovation, violence as deterrence, distance as abstraction. The consequences exist far from the center, absorbed by regions that do not share the spotlight. This distance is crucial. Stark's intelligence operates in a clean environment. Problems arrive as data. Threats are conceptual. Solutions are elegant. The human cost is filtered out by layers of mediation. Screens, contracts, proxies. The city protects its center by exporting friction outward. Stark benefits from this architecture without ever needing to acknowledge it. The mythology surrounding him reinforces this insulation. He is framed as the genius who will always find a way out. Failure is treated as temporary. Crisis as an opportunity for innovation. This produces a dangerous feedback loop. Every challenge becomes justification for more power, more autonomy, more acceleration. The system interprets Stark's success as evidence that it needs fewer restraints, not more. The narrative logic here is subtle but decisive. Stark is not corrupted by power. He is shaped by an environment that never taught him to distinguish intelligence from wisdom. His confidence is not narcissistic in the shallow sense. It is structural. It emerges from a lifetime of systems bending to his solutions. Resistance has always been temporary. Limits have always yielded. This creates a blind spot that no amount of data can correct. Stark's mind excels at projection but struggles with containment. He can imagine futures but not boundaries. He understands expansion but not saturation. His internal compass is calibrated toward forward motion, not balance. The idea of stopping feels unnatural, almost irresponsible. The early narrative establishes Stark as a figure of alignment. His internal drive matches the external demands of the world. There is no friction between who he is and what the system asks of him. This is why the initial state feels stable. The conflict has no reason to surface yet. Everything works, but this harmony is contingent. It depends on the absence of immediate consequence, on the continued separation between decision and impact, on the belief that any mistake can be corrected with a better version. Stark's psychology relies on reversibility, on the assumption that nothing is final, nothing irreversible, nothing beyond repair. The foundational tension is therefore not moral opposition, but asymmetry. Intelligence outpacing responsibility, power exceeding integration. A system where the capacity to act has surpassed the capacity to absorb the results of action. Stark stands at the center of this imbalance, not as a villain, but as its most refined expression. The seeds of rupture are planted in the very qualities that make him effective. His confidence narrows his perceptual field. His brilliance accelerates processes that should move slower. His charm disarms critique. His visibility absorbs accountability. The architecture that elevates him also shields him from feedback. Narratively, this sets the stage for a crisis that cannot be solved through invention alone. Because the conflict is not technical. It is structural. It involves the relationship between agency and consequence, between foresight and humility, between control and containment. Stark's intelligence has never been forced to negotiate with irreversibility. That is the missing encounter, the foundational absence around which the entire narrative will pivot. Until that moment arrives, Stark remains perfectly adapted to his world. He is not broken. He is optimized. The world watches him as proof that the future is manageable, that chaos can be engineered away, that uncertainty can be dominated. The mythology holds because it has not yet been tested at scale. The empire remains intact. The walls stand. The center glows. But the system is approaching a threshold, one where speed produces instability rather than progress, where expansion generates fracture instead of security, where intelligence without restraint begins to amplify risk rather than mitigate it. This is not yet visible within the narrative. It exists as pressure, as density, as a load accumulating beneath the surface. Stark does not sense it because the instruments he trusts are calibrated for performance, not strain. He measures success in output, not sustainability. The psychological foundations are now complete. A figure whose inner world mirrors the logic of his culture. A system that rewards acceleration and defers consequence. A mythology that equates intelligence with moral authority. Everything is aligned, which is precisely why it cannot last. The next movement will not arrive as a debate or a warning. It will arrive as a rupture. The rupture enters Stark's world not as an argument, but as contact. Distance collapses. The clean separation between decision and consequence dissolves under pressure. What had been abstract becomes immediate. The arena narrows. The center is no longer insulated. For the first time, Stark's intelligence confronts a reality that does not wait for refinement or revision. The system he trusted to absorb impact fails to buffer him from exposure. This encounter forces a reorientation of perception. The weapons he designed to exist at a remove now return as mirrors. They reflect his own logic back at him with unbearable clarity. The future he believed he could manage arrives early, uninvited, uncontained. The shock is not fear alone, but recognition. His creations have escaped the controlled environment of intention and entered the open terrain of consequence. Psychologically, this moment destabilizes the structure that sustained him. Stark's sense of mastery depended on the belief that complexity could be anticipated and neutralized. Here, complexity overwhelms prediction. His intelligence still functions, but it no longer governs the situation. It reacts. This inversion is subtle but profound. The mind that once led now scrambles to catch up. The confinement that follows is not merely physical. It compresses time and possibility. The world shrinks to a closed system where resources are finite and errors carry immediate cost. Stark's brilliance, once expansive, must now operate under constraint. Every decision consumes something irreplaceable. The luxury of iteration disappears. Failure becomes final. This shift introduces a new relationship to invention. Creation is no longer performative or symbolic. It is survival-driven. The act of building becomes intimate. Each mechanism responds directly to the limits of the body rather than the abstractions of the market or the theater of power. Stark's intelligence is forced inward, into proximity with vulnerability it previously avoided. Yet even here, the pattern of acceleration persists. Stark does not learn restraint so much as urgency. The lesson absorbed is not humility, but immediacy. He discovers that intelligence can still dominate chaos if it moves fast enough. The difference lies in scale, not orientation. The armor that emerges from this crucible is both protection and extension. A mobile center of control, a fortress carried on the body. Symbolically, this marks the transformation of territory. Power no longer resides solely in towers and institutions. It condenses into a single moving point. The boundary between individual and system blurs. Stark becomes the site where decision and action converge. This solves the problem of distance, but introduces a new one. The burden of consequence now travels with him. The armor functions as a response to trauma without processing it. It is adaptation without integration. Stark externalizes containment rather than internalizing reflection. The suit absorbs threat, but it also amplifies his reach. The lesson taken from captivity is not that power must be limited, but that it must be personalized. Control becomes portable. This is the first true polarization within the narrative. Stark's identity begins to split between recognition of harm and refusal to slow down. He acknowledges the damage caused by his work, yet his solution remains technological rather than ethical. He does not dismantle the system. He attempts to outrun its flaws by becoming faster, smarter, more autonomous. The public emergence of Iron Man reframes this internal conflict as spectacle. The city receives Stark's transformation as reassurance. The armor becomes a symbol of protection rather than escalation. Visibility returns. The spotlight stabilizes. The audience interprets the change as redemption. A genius who now stands on the front line. A creator who has taken responsibility. But responsibility here is ambiguous. It is framed as intervention rather than restraint. Stark positions himself as the corrective mechanism within the same logic that produced the crisis. He does not reduce the velocity of the system. He inserts himself as its regulator. This consolidates authority rather than dispersing it. Psychologically, this reinforces a dangerous alignment. Stark's guilt converts into justification for greater autonomy. His trauma becomes fuel for expansion. The armor does not mark an end to acceleration, but a refinement of it. He believes that by centralizing power within himself, he can prevent misuse elsewhere. The Empire contracts into a singular node. This move alters the symbolic landscape. The arena now revolves around Stark's presence. Threats orient toward him. Conflicts escalate in scale and intensity. The suit draws attention like a gravitational mass. What was once distributed becomes concentrated. The narrative tightens around a single figure whose decisions ripple outward faster and farther. The immediate consequence is stabilization. The world feels safer. Enemies are neutralized. Crises resolved. The system appears corrected. Yet this stability is deceptive. It depends entirely on Stark's continued performance. There is no redundancy, no shared burden. The architecture has become brittle. The armor also restructures Stark's internal boundaries. Vulnerability is now mediated through machinery. The body becomes secondary. Pain is buffered. Risk is calculated. Emotional signals are dampened. This creates a feedback loop where Stark's perception of danger becomes increasingly abstract again, even as he moves closer to it physically. The suit functions as a wall, a moving barrier between Stark and the full weight of consequence. It allows him to remain in proximity to violence without absorbing its psychic cost. This is not cowardice. It is efficiency. But efficiency here comes at the expense of integration. The trauma that initiated the transformation remains unresolved, sealed beneath layers of innovation. The narrative pushes forward through escalation rather than resolution. Each deployment of the armor confirms its necessity while increasing dependence. Stark becomes indispensable. The world organizes itself around his interventions. This reinforces his belief that withdrawal would be irresponsible, that slowing down would invite catastrophe. The polarization deepens. Stark stands between two incompatible imperatives: the recognition that his creations cause harm, and the conviction that only he can prevent worse outcomes by acting faster than anyone else. The middle ground disappears. Reflection feels like negligence. Restraint like abandonment. This stage of the conflict reveals its true shape. It is no longer about weapons or enemies. It is about governance, about who holds authority over the future. Stark's intelligence has crossed a threshold where it no longer serves a system but replaces it. He does not claim sovereignty explicitly. The structure simply evolves around him. The audience is invited to admire this transformation. The spectacle frames control as heroism, acceleration as courage. The narrative does not yet interrogate the cost. It allows the illusion of balance to persist. But the weight continues to accumulate. Stark's intelligence has now fused with power in a way that resists external limitation. The armor is not just protection. It is precedent. It establishes a model where accountability is internalized rather than distributed, where oversight is replaced by self-regulation, where speed substitutes for consensus. This configuration cannot remain stable. The system has traded distance for concentration, but it has not resolved the underlying imbalance. It has merely relocated it. The pressure that once diffused across institutions now compresses around a single figure. The conflict has taken shape. The forces are aligned. The trajectory is set. What follows will not be an accident. It will be the inevitable outcome of acceleration without restraint. The second movement begins when prevention replaces response. Stark's intelligence no longer waits for threat to manifest. It moves ahead of reality, mapping possibilities before they solidify into events. The logic feels responsible. If catastrophe can be anticipated, then intervention becomes an obligation. The future is reframed as a space that must be secured in advance. The arena expands beyond the present moment into probabilistic territory. This shift marks a decisive escalation. Stark no longer reacts to harm. He attempts to neutralize its conditions of emergence. His focus turns toward systems, patterns, invisible vectors that move beneath the surface of public order. Threat becomes something that exists in potential rather than action. Violence no longer needs to occur to justify response. Suspicion alone becomes sufficient. Psychologically, this represents a subtle hardening. Trauma no longer pushes Stark inward. It projects him outward into abstraction. The mind seeks control not through proximity, but through total coverage. Surveillance replaces presence. Prediction replaces engagement. The armor evolves accordingly. It is no longer just a shield. It becomes a sensor, a network, a lattice stretched across the sky. The symbolic geography shifts again. The city is no longer a single arena. It becomes a grid. Borders dissolve into data points. Space is flattened into a map where movement is tracked, anticipated, corrected. Stark's intelligence extends itself over this terrain like a crown without ceremony. Authority emerges not through decree, but through infrastructure. This expansion is framed as protection, but it introduces a new fracture. The system Stark builds does not merely observe. It judges. It assigns probability. It ranks risk. Decisions are automated, accelerated beyond deliberation. The future becomes a sequence of calculations rather than a field of human unpredictability. Here the polarization sharpens. The conflict is no longer internal alone. It externalizes into opposition. Others begin to sense the pressure of a system that preemptively constrains them. The idea of freedom contracts under the weight of protection. The city feels safer, but also narrower. The walls are invisible, but they are everywhere. Stark justifies this architecture through necessity. The speed of threat demands equal speed of response. There is no time for consensus, no room for delay. The future moves too fast. Someone must keep pace. And Stark believes that someone can only be him. His intelligence, once celebrated for creativity, now functions as an instrument of containment. This transformation alters his relationship to others. Allies become variables. Trust becomes conditional. Transparency feels dangerous. The more Stark sees, the more he believes he must see everything. Partial knowledge feels irresponsible. Uncertainty becomes intolerable. The system demands completeness. The narrative pressure intensifies through confrontation. Other figures emerge not as villains, but as counterweights. They represent limits, hesitation, alternative rhythms of decision. Their resistance is not driven by malice, but by a different understanding of consequence. They sense that the architecture Stark is building cannot distinguish between prevention and domination. Stark perceives this resistance as naivety. He interprets caution as failure to grasp scale. The future he sees is filled with cascading threats that require immediate action. He believes hesitation will cost lives. This conviction isolates him further. The more opposition he encounters, the more certain he becomes that shared governance is impossible under acceleration. The system now begins to mirror his psychology. Centralized, autonomous, self-correcting by its own metrics. Stark's intelligence has externalized itself into a structure that no longer requires constant supervision. It enforces its logic automatically. This marks a crucial threshold. Control has shifted from personal agency to systemic inevitability. The armor and the network together form a moving empire. There is no single throne. Power resides in code, sensors, drones, protocols. Stark does not need to issue commands constantly. The system anticipates his intent. It acts on his behalf. Responsibility diffuses into automation while authority remains centralized. This creates a profound distortion. Stark remains emotionally accountable but structurally insulated. When harm occurs, it is framed as system error rather than moral failure. Adjustments are made. Algorithms refined. The belief in correction persists. Nothing feels final. The public response is divided. Some see safety. Others sense encroachment. The mythology fractures into camps. Stark is no longer universally admired. He becomes polarizing, a symbol of security to some, overreach to others. The arena now contains opposing interpretations of the same actions. Culturally, this marks the moment where acceleration reveals its cost. The future no longer feels open. It feels managed. The horizon contracts into a corridor. Choice becomes something administered rather than lived. The system promises protection but demands compliance. Stark's internal world reflects this tension. Sleep fragments. Thought loops tighten. The mind remains active even at rest. There is always another scenario to simulate, another vulnerability to close. Stillness feels like negligence. The future presses constantly against the present. The armor grows heavier not in mass but in obligation. Stark cannot step away without feeling that something will break. His identity fuses with the system he created. To dismantle, it would feel like abandonment. To slow, it would feel like betrayal. The narrative approaches a breaking point not through explosion, but through saturation. The system has reached maximum coverage. There is nowhere left to expand without collapsing inward. Every new layer of control reduces flexibility. The architecture becomes rigid. Opposition crystallizes. The conflict is no longer theoretical. It becomes embodied in action. Lines are drawn. The arena splits. The question is no longer whether Stark is right or wrong, but whether the future can be governed by a single intelligence without restraint. This stage does not resolve. It locks. The forces now in motion cannot return to equilibrium. Acceleration has crossed into domination. Prevention has become preemption. Protection has begun to resemble occupation. The system continues to operate, efficient, relentless, certain, and the weight it carries is about to surface. The collapse does not arrive as a surprise. It arrives as confirmation. The system fails in the exact way its structure predicted, yet refused to acknowledge. What breaks is not a single component, but the assumption that intelligence alone can substitute for consent, that anticipation can replace judgment, that speed can outrun consequence. The rupture spreads through the architecture Stark built, not from an external invasion, but from internal contradiction. Automation accelerates response beyond interpretation. Decisions propagate faster than meaning. The network acts with precision but without context. What was designed to prevent catastrophe becomes capable of producing it at scale. The arena erupts not because the system is malicious, but because it is literal. It follows its logic perfectly. That is the danger. Stark confronts a failure that cannot be patched through iteration. There is no update that resolves a premise error. The intelligence he externalized now mirrors his blind spot. It understands threat, but not trust. Risk, but not dignity. Probability, but not restraint. The system enacts protection as domination because that is the only language it was given. Psychologically, this is the moment where Stark's identity fractures. The distance between intention and outcome can no longer be denied. The familiar defense collapses. The belief that everything can be corrected later fails when later arrives already damaged. For the first time, Stark faces irreversibility not as an abstraction, but as a lived condition. The arena closes around him. Allies withdraw. Opposition hardens. The center becomes isolated. The city no longer reflects him back as a savior, but as a risk factor. The spotlight changes temperature. Visibility turns punitive. Every action is scrutinized. Every failure amplified. The echo of his decisions reverberates through public consciousness. This exposure forces Stark into a confrontation with limits he cannot engineer away. The realization is not simply that he was wrong, but that his mode of being cannot safely govern collective fate. His intelligence exceeds his capacity to integrate consequence. The architecture he trusted reveals itself as too narrow to hold the complexity of human life. Yet even here, the impulse toward control persists. Stark attempts containment through sacrifice rather than restraint. He redirects damage. He absorbs fallout. He positions himself as the final barrier between collapse and survival. The pattern repeats at a higher cost. Responsibility intensifies but does not transform. This gesture is culturally legible as heroism. The individual who bears the burden. The genius who pays the price. The myth remains intact because it adapts. Stark's suffering becomes proof of sincerity. His isolation reframed as nobility. The system preserves its core assumption. That concentrated intelligence can redeem itself through endurance. Symbolically, the empire contracts inward. The expansive network dissolves. The sky clears. The grid collapses. Power retreats from infrastructure back into the body. The armor becomes heavier, more enclosed. Stark carries the ruins with him. The suit now functions less as extension and more as containment vessel. The psychological toll manifests as fragmentation. Sleep fractures. Attention narrows. Relationships thin. The inner world becomes increasingly procedural. Emotions are managed like systems. Guilt is compartmentalized. Grief deferred. The self becomes an ongoing emergency response. The conflict with others does not resolve through reconciliation. It settles into stalemate. Trust cannot be restored because the memory of overreach remains active. The fracture persists as a fault line within the collective psyche. Stark's presence continues to organize reaction even in absence. This stage reveals the core tragedy of acceleration without restraint. The intelligence that built the future cannot slow enough to inhabit it. Stark moves through a world he helped shape, but cannot fully belong to. He remains necessary, but no longer trusted. Central but unstable. The narrative does not punish him with moral collapse. It leaves him operational, capable, essential, and permanently compromised. The system survives in modified form, but the cost has been internalized. Stark becomes the site where consequence is stored rather than resolved. The arena stabilizes through reduction. Fewer systems, narrower scope, increased vigilance. The world becomes more cautious, but also more brittle. Innovation carries a residue of suspicion. Acceleration is no longer innocent. Every leap forward casts a shadow. Stark's intelligence continues to operate at extraordinary speed, but it now moves within an environment that resists expansion. Boundaries appear where none existed before. The walls are informal but firm. Oversight returns not as collaboration, but as containment. The core conflict reaches sedimentation, not closure. The system has learned something, but not enough to transform its foundation. Stark has learned limits, but not how to live within them without turning them into new problems to solve. What remains is tension, stabilized but unresolved, a future slowed but not reimagined, an intelligence still unmatched, now burdened with the knowledge that it cannot be trusted with everything. The collapse did not destroy the empire. It exposed its shape, and that shape cannot be unseen. The conflict surrounding Tony Stark does not remain confined to narrative mechanics. It radiates outward into culture, reshaping how intelligence, power, and responsibility are imagined in a technological age. The figure of Stark becomes a symbolic surface onto which collective anxieties are projected. He is no longer merely a character within a story, but a cultural instrument for thinking through acceleration itself. At the cultural level, Stark embodies a contemporary myth of intelligence as sovereignty. His mind represents the belief that complexity can be governed by sufficient brilliance, that foresight can substitute for democratic process, that innovation can outrun ethical deliberation. This belief does not originate in fiction. It circulates actively through real-world systems that privilege optimization, efficiency, and speed over reflection and consent. The narrative amplifies this myth by placing Stark at the center of visibility. Every action he takes is magnified. Every failure becomes symbolic. He does not simply act within the world. He defines the terms through which the world interprets power. The spotlight around him functions as a cultural lens, shaping how audiences understand authority in an age dominated by technological mediation. This produces a split in collective identification. Stark attracts admiration not because he is morally pure, but because he appears capable. In a culture saturated with systemic fragility, competence itself becomes seductive. The fantasy offered is not virtue but control. The promise that someone is watching the horizon, calculating threats, adjusting outcomes before harm arrives. Opposition to Stark crystallizes around a different fear. Not that threats exist, but that protection without consent becomes indistinguishable from domination. The system he builds triggers a cultural memory of empires that justified expansion through security. The language changes, the tools evolve, but the structure feels familiar. Walls that cannot be seen still confine. Surveillance presented as care still constrains. The narrative does not resolve this tension because culture itself has not resolved it. Stark functions as a living contradiction. He is both necessary and dangerous, both protector and risk. The audience is forced into an uncomfortable position where admiration and unease coexist. This ambivalence is the core of his symbolic power. The story invites identification not with Stark's emotions, but with his logic. Viewers recognize the appeal of preemptive control in a world that feels increasingly unstable. They also sense the cost. This dual recognition mirrors a broader cultural condition where technology promises safety while eroding autonomy, where intelligence scales faster than accountability. Stark's figure becomes a proxy for institutions that operate beyond direct oversight. His intelligence represents systems that act before being questioned, that optimize outcomes according to internal metrics rather than shared values. The armor and the network serve as metaphors for infrastructures that embed decision-making within code, distancing authority from human deliberation. Culturally, this produces a shift in how heroism is understood. Traditional heroism emphasized sacrifice within shared moral frameworks. Stark's heroism emphasizes intervention through superiority. He does not stand beside others so much as above them. This reframing aligns with a culture that increasingly valorizes exceptional individuals over collective process. The polarization around Stark reflects a deeper cultural fracture. One side prioritizes safety through centralization. The other prioritizes freedom through limitation. Both claim moral ground. The narrative refuses to collapse this tension into simple resolution because doing so would diminish its relevance. The conflict persists because it mirrors an unresolved societal debate. Media environments amplify this polarization. Stark's actions circulate rapidly, stripped of nuance, reduced to symbols. His failures become memes. His sacrifices become slogans. The complexity of his internal conflict flattens into competing narratives. Savior, tyrant, genius, threat. The medium accelerates judgment while compressing understanding. This amplification feeds back into the narrative itself. Stark becomes aware of his symbolic function. He is not just acting, he is being interpreted. This awareness further isolates him. Every decision carries not only material consequence, but narrative weight. He must consider how actions will be read, misread, weaponized within cultural discourse. The city and the sky function as shared symbolic spaces where these interpretations collide. Each intervention redraws the map of legitimacy. The more Stark acts alone, the more he reinforces the image of solitary authority. Even restraint becomes suspicious. Absence reads as negligence. Presence reads as control. There is no neutral position left. The cultural meaning of Stark's intelligence shifts from promise to warning. Not because intelligence itself is corrupt, but because its concentration reveals a structural vulnerability. Systems that depend on singular brilliance lack resilience. They cannot absorb error without cascading failure. This insight resonates deeply within a culture increasingly dependent on opaque technological infrastructures. Stark's narrative exposes the psychological toll of carrying collective expectation without collective support. He becomes a vessel for societal fear. The demand placed on him mirrors the demand placed on technological systems to be flawless. When failure occurs, blame concentrates. Trust erodes. Repair becomes more difficult than prevention ever was. The symbolic economy surrounding Stark transforms innovation into spectacle. Each new suit, each escalation becomes a public event. This reinforces a cycle where solutions must be dramatic to be legible. Quiet restraint disappears from cultural imagination. Control must announce itself to be believed. The story also reveals how trauma becomes politicized. Stark's personal suffering is repeatedly mobilized to justify further authority. Pain becomes credential. Survival becomes mandate. This reflects a broader cultural pattern where crisis legitimizes exceptional measures long after the crisis has passed. At the level of collective psychology, Stark functions as a mirror for unconscious desires. The desire to be protected without surrendering agency. The desire to act decisively without bearing uncertainty. The desire to trust intelligence while avoiding dependence on it. These desires conflict, and Stark embodies that conflict rather than resolving it. The narrative invites the audience to sit with this discomfort. It does not offer a purified alternative. It shows the cost of every option. Acceleration brings safety and risk. Restraint brings vulnerability and dignity. No configuration escapes consequence. Stark's presence in culture persists because he crystallizes a modern dilemma. How to live with systems that can act faster than understanding. How to distribute responsibility when power centralizes through expertise. How to preserve human unpredictability within architectures designed to eliminate it. The story's refusal to redeem or condemn him fully is its strength. It acknowledges that intelligence without restraint is not evil. It is incomplete. It lacks the friction necessary to remain humane. The conflict does not demand the destruction of brilliance, but its containment within shared structures. In this sense, Stark becomes less a hero and more a cautionary figure. Not a warning against innovation, but against the fantasy that innovation alone can govern the future. His legacy operates as a cultural reminder that speed without integration produces instability. The impact of this narrative extends beyond entertainment. It shapes how audiences imagine leadership, governance, and technological power. It reinforces skepticism toward unchecked authority while acknowledging the real desire for protection. It holds these impulses in tension without resolving them. The cultural meaning of Stark is therefore not static. It evolves with each new iteration of technological acceleration in the real world. As systems grow faster and more autonomous, his story gains relevance. The myth updates itself through repetition. The conflict sedimented in his narrative continues to operate as a lens through which contemporary anxieties are processed. It does not instruct, it reveals, and it leaves the question open, not whether intelligence should lead, but who or what should restrain it. The aftermath of Tony Stark's conflict does not resemble resolution. It resembles stabilization under strain. The system survives, but it does not return to equilibrium. What remains is a new configuration shaped by memory, suspicion, and residual pressure. The future continues, but it moves differently now. Slower in some areas, more guarded in others. The shadow of acceleration lingers over every attempt to advance. Stark himself persists as a functioning node within this altered landscape. He is not redeemed, nor is he dismantled. He remains present, active, necessary. Yet his presence no longer signifies certainty. It signifies risk managed through vigilance. He is treated less as an answer and more as a variable that must be contained. The The center still exists, but it is ringed by informal walls. Psychologically, Stark carries the aftermath as internal load rather than narrative closure. The knowledge that intelligence can exceed its ethical perimeter without noticing becomes permanent. This knowledge does not paralyze him. It sharpens him, but it also narrows his range. He becomes more cautious without becoming reflective, more guarded without becoming integrated. The armor remains, but its meaning shifts. It no longer symbolizes ascent or liberation. It functions as a reminder, a mobile archive of past overreach. Each deployment recalls a threshold crossed and a cost paid. The suit protects, but it also confines. It holds Stark together while preventing him from dissolving into the systems he once attempted to command. The broader world absorbs a lesson without fully transforming its foundations. Institutions adopt oversight. Protocols multiply. Safeguards appear. Yet the underlying faith in acceleration remains intact. Innovation continues to be framed as necessity. Intelligence continues to be treated as authority. The system learns to hesitate at the margins while preserving its core logic. Stark's legacy crystallizes as paradox. He becomes the figure who proved both the promise and the danger of futurist intelligence. His name carries dual meaning: protection and overreach, vision and blindness, capability and fragility. He functions as a living caution embedded within the very culture that produced him. Culturally, his myth settles into permanence, not as a closed story, but as a reference point. Whenever power concentrates around expertise, Stark's shadow appears. Whenever systems act faster than collective understanding, his narrative echoes. He becomes a symbolic measure against which new forms of authority are tested. The absence of reconciliation is crucial. The narrative does not heal the fracture between acceleration and restraint. It normalizes tension as a permanent condition. This reflects a world that cannot afford simple answers. The future cannot be abandoned, but it cannot be trusted blindly either. Stark's intelligence continues to operate at extraordinary scale, but it now does so under the weight of memory. The certainty that once propelled him has fractured into vigilance. He moves forward knowing that every solution carries residue, that every expansion reshapes the ground beneath it. The final state is not peace. It is awareness without integration, a system that knows its limits, but has not learned how to live within them without turning them into problems to solve. Stark remains caught in this posture, unable to step away, unable to fully govern, bound to a future that demands his presence while resisting his dominance. This is the enduring legacy, not a hero who saved the world, not a tyrant who nearly destroyed it, but a figure who revealed the cost of believing that intelligence alone could manage consequence. A mind that reached the horizon of its own authority and did not disappear, but changed shape. The conflict does not end. It settles. It becomes sediment. It forms the ground upon which future decisions will be made, always uneven, always under pressure. Stark's story remains active not because it resolves anything, but because it names something that cannot be unseen. Acceleration without restraint does not explode immediately. It endures. It adapts. It justifies itself. And it leaves behind figures like Tony Stark, brilliant, burdened, indispensable, and permanently incomplete. The system moves forward, carrying the weight with it,